Foundation, the leading organization for all art curators, serving many, not few. It is a pleasure to welcome you to today's virtual discussion. Thank you for joining us. We hope that you, our the leading colleagues, organization allies, for and all art curators around the globe many are healthy and safe. It is a pleasure to welcome you to today's we held over 50 programs bringing together we hope that you, 1,300 individuals, colleagues, organizations for all artists around the globe many on critical topics for the nonprofit. It is a pleasure to welcome you to today's we held early March of this year. Thank you for bringing together. We hope that you, 1,300 individuals, colleagues, organizations for all as well as concerns rising from the current pandemic. We've greatly enhanced an already robust online programming calendar by presenting varied offerings such as the one we are gathered together for today. With your participation and feedback, we continue to ensure we are addressing the needs of our audience and moving the field forwards towards an equitable, inclusive, and sustainable future. For many years, we have been presenting webinars, virtual programming, which are accessible on our website through archived recordings. You can also find information on upcoming ones on our website as well, at artcurators.org. We hope that they provide actionable advice, value, and connectivity. We welcome all nonprofit art curators to join our organization. Benefits of membership include networking with our global audience, access to discounted and free in-person and virtual programs and fellowships, and importantly, the opportunity to be part of a unified voice for and of curators. Additionally, our foundation serves the larger curatorial and arts community, and should you wish, donations are welcome from you as an individual, a corporation, and/or foundation. Any amount will have direct impact on our work. You can see options for donating on our site. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the program.
Welcome, everyone. I know a few people are still making their way in, but I want to send out my gratitude for all of you joining us today over your lunch hour, your evening hour, maybe it's breakfast from where you're tuning in. My name is Nicole Sukup, and I'm the Assistant Curator of Contemporary Art and the Coordinator for the Minnesota Artist Exhibition Program. And it is my genuine honor to introduce our panelists today and to give a brief run through of our conversation. And so with that, I want to just take a moment and say our panel will discuss how regionalism intersects, shapes identity, equity, and curatorial praxis. Regionalism is defined as identities, histories, and cultures shaped by geography rather than other systems, as museums write land acknowledgments, shape exhibitions around identity and community, or strive for authentic relationships with different community groups. Intersectionality matters now more than ever. Context matters now more than ever. And so with that, it is, like I said, my great honor to introduce John G. Hampton, the Executive Director and CEO of the Mackenzie Art Gallery, or Musée d'Art Mackenzie. Tamar Hemez, Assistant Curator at the Tate Liverpool. And Maria Elena Ortiz, Curator at the Perez. And so today's format and flow, I'm going to ask some general questions and allow each of the panelists to describe their curatorial praxis and how that intersects with regional identities or regional and communities. And then we'll take it from there and ask a few questions, but really open it up to you to ask questions. And so just as a reminder, as Judith noted in just before, please ask questions through the Q&A. I'll be moderating and bringing up questions as they come along. If there are similar questions, I might merge and shape those accordingly, but please ask away as we dive right in. And so with that, I am gonna start and ask John, if you are willing to go first. So John, I live in Minnesota. I am thoroughly Minnesotan. We like to think of ourselves as Canadian as it gets in the United States, but we are not in Canada, much to our maybe chagrin at times. And so Canada has a different set of laws, it has different praxis, but Saskatchewan has a really important community that the Mackenzie serves. And so I'm really interested to hear about your experience as both formerly the director of programs and your current experience as the director at the Mackenzie, and how has your experience and your own curatorial praxis shaped your understanding of the region? And how does that kind of intersect with either D&I or just how you see the museum intersecting at large?
Hello, thank you. So the Mackenzie is situated on Treaty 4 territory in the province of Saskatchewan, Regina, Waskanika, and so we're the homeland of the Métis Nation here, traditional territories of the Cree, Anishinaabe, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota. And the Mackenzies, for I think since the 1970s, really, has situated our practice within our location. Before that, we were built very much within a colonial model of the museum, of this idea of collecting artifacts from and antiquities and art from abroad and bringing it to us to create a sense of center to share the world with the citizens here. And then in the 70s is through Bob Boyer, the late Bob Boyer, is a Métis artist who began curating shows at the Mackenzie, sharing our collection with the province, bringing them into the reservations and the rural communities around here, and creating space for Indigenous-led art in a way that hadn't been done before. And then that history continued to be, we were the first public art gallery in Canada to appoint a Indigenous head curator, Leanne Martin. I have the dubious honor of being the first Indigenous director of a non-Indigenous gallery, public art gallery in Canada. And we very much situate our activities within the location we are here, which are, proud to be the home of Idle No More, of so many activists and important voices, and the Indigenous identity here being so important. We're also in Saskatchewan for Canada to have the largest number of residential school students of any province. The last schools to close in Canada and in North America were here in Regina and nearby in Marival. 1996 is when the Marival residential school closed. We were announced less than an hour ago. Chief Cadmus Delorme, who I went to school with, he was the head of the student council at First Nation University while I was still in university here, announced that 751 unmarked graves were discovered at that residential school, just over an hour and a half drive from the Mackenzie Art Gallery. Our community members, family, and so moments like those, that regional specificity becomes imperative. It's our partners, our staff, our community members, our family who are grieving and who lost their family, and there's as an institution that is stewarding the culture of this region, how do you address and create that space for that grief and for what your community needs to process and define and come to terms with who you are as a community, as a species, as a nation. So that's where I'll put it off right now.
I do want to thank you for joining us also during this time and so shortly after the news broke, John. You know, those are, I think, questions that I know I've been grappling with in Minneapolis since the murder of George Floyd, but also the murder of a number of Black men since and before in Minneapolis by state violence. Those are heavy questions and not easy answers when we come from also a tradition of museum and museumology, of collecting and colonial practice. Maybe now is an opportunity to turn and also ask how, you know, how are you integrating community and holding space for community in the museum that you just reopened on June 12th? I'm thinking here maybe of programs like Community Watch and the really powerful film series that you've brought over from, and now I'm gonna have to look at my notes real quick. The Kiss Kissy Yape Yawin film series. And also your exhibition, Pasapap, Kid Jinya Young. And I apologize, my Anishinaabe and my First Nations language is not where it used to be when I was in university. So I apologize to everybody for that pronunciation, but I am intrigued by holding language through a talking rock and other exhibitions.
Yeah, so Kiskisia Peowin is exhibition. It's free for Threads of Memory, organized by Janine Windoff, so former curator of community engagement here at the Mackenzie, now the director of Indigenous programming at the Banff Center for the Arts. Is a wonderful series of videos, of short films created by filmmakers from around the world with an emphasis on Saskatchewan filmmakers. And it really gives this some global context to our stories here, and helps us understand our place within what's happening within the global pandemic, and then placing it into context of local cultures, experiences, residential school systems. It's when we reopened the gallery 12 days ago, we have all new exhibitions there, and they do really resonate with this current moment and give space. The Touching Earth and Sky, curated by our curatorial fellow Felicia Gay, looks at Indigenous understandings of adoption and how they conflict with the way that adoption has played in Indigenous communities, has impacted from Western perspectives, has impacted our communities. So there's some really powerful works there dealing with the 60s scoop from artists who grew up in this community. There's advertisements. Brad LaRock, a local artist, it's his first foray into really this more narrative type of work, but there's he's included an advertisement from our local newspaper, the Regina Leader Post, that has a photo of him that says, "I need a home," from the Adopt Indian and Métis program. That's in a scrapbook from his mother that just said, "I saw an ad for him in the paper and I had to have him." So there's seeing those stories from our local paper, then just really puts that human side of it and sees how we're connected. This Saskatchewan, La Rivière qui passe entre les rochers, the river that passes between the rocks, that I curated with Leolia Shragi, who's a Persian Samoan curator based in Australia right now. It looks at language in the shadow of colonialism. So artists from across Turtle Island and the Great Ocean in the Pacific Islands. It really stemmed from looking at local language revitalization efforts and the artists working in that field, like Joy Archon, and trying to look at artists from other regions and how they were also trying to articulate the movement of languages after the imposition of colonial tongues. And so is a exhibition that's quite far-reaching and can look at, from Maori barcloth revitalization to American artists like Rashad Newsom looking at Black vernacular gestures and the invention of new semantics amongst colonial oppression and repression, and then also from Canadian Filipino diaspora experiences of what looking at trying to articulate what language is to artists like Patrick Cruz, and growing up in a Canadian context and trying to reconnect or understand Baybayin script, the pre-colonial Filipino script before waves of American and Spanish colonization there. And so to really situate how these local dialogues and movements and how they connect to these larger global trends because of these shared experiences of colonization, and how we can learn and process from each other and participate in that dialogue from someplace like Saskatchewan that's had a very large impact on the international scene, but also is a very small place, physically large. That's roughly the size of California, but a population in our province of just over 1 million people.
I think this idea of local dialogue is a great segue then over to Tamar and the project you've been doing at Tate Liverpool. And so I am interested to hear first of all, what is it like to work at the Tate Liverpool when you have such a predominant or dominant sister organization just in London? And what does it mean to work with an artist like, say, Elisa Nissenbaum on the project that you recently wrapped up with her?
I think we work obviously in a very different context because Tate Liverpool is one of 4 Tate sites. So we've got Tate Britain and Tate Modern in London, and then we've got Tate St Ives, which is in Cornwall in the south of England, whereas we're in the northwest of England. And Tate was first opened in 1897. So we're working with a collection that has been built over many, many years that we share between sites. That's a collection that hasn't always reflected the communities that we have around us, or just in general haven't always reflected diversity. That's something that we're very much working on, and that collection is very much developing. But I think the thing that we're mainly facing is how do we sort of embrace the fact that we're a regional museum while still also having to maintain that international outlook. So, how do we sort of reevaluate our collection, show the works that people expect to see at a museum like Tate? If we don't show the Picassos, for example, we will get complaints, but we've also got a very interesting local community around us. Liverpool itself is a port city. It very much developed as a port city in 17th century, 18th century. because of transatlantic trade, because of slave trade. That's something that is very visible at Tate Liverpool. We're housed in a warehouse that was used to store tobacco, sugar. We've got the slavery museum right next to us. So that's very much part of our history and our locality. And with that comes that Liverpool is actually quite a multicultural city. So, you know, the oldest Black community in Britain is in Liverpool, one of the oldest Chinese communities. There's a huge Irish influence as well. So I think what we're very much looking at, especially at the moment, is how do we sort of bring all those elements into our galleries with the collection that we have that's not built specifically for Liverpool. So one of the things that we're doing at the moment is we're preparing an entirely new collection rehang, where we're very much focusing on those local stories and looking at how to bring them out, and how they relate to international artworks and British artworks. And with that, bringing in local voices, bringing in local expertise, you know, very much acknowledging that we in the curatorial team don't necessarily have that expertise. You know, ways in which we do that is through conversation with others, but also we're working on an interpretation project where, you know, we have artwork labels written by other people who are not part of Tate, so that we get those different perspectives in there. And I think, I mean, with Tate Liverpool in general, so Tate Liverpool was opened in 1988, so much later than Tate Britain, which was the first London site. The idea was always that Tate Liverpool would very much focus on younger audiences. That's something that we still very much do. And I think part of the reason for that is that, you know, Tate has a certain image. It's not always the easiest place for people to enter. It's not everyone sees it as being accessible, and that's something that we constantly have to work on. So, you know, the type of things that we do is work with what we call our Tate Collective producers. It's a group of people between 16 and 25 who work with us on a regular basis, who get to organize events within our galleries that we work on with them that relate to our program. We've got something called Ideas Depot, which is a collection display that is curated by very young children. So, you know, 4 or 5, 6-year-olds get to select the artworks, they get to help sort of explain what the works are about. So it's all these types of things to make sure that from a young age, people feel welcome and feel that their voices are also heard. I mean, there's a lot of things that we do. I think a lot of what comes in terms of community is opening up our building to people from all over Liverpool and the Northwest region. So, you know, we've got Tate Exchange, which is a space within the gallery where we work with different partners. That's our university partners in the city, but also, for example, we work with an organization who focus on prison education. So we work with prisoners in the Northwest and with their families as a way of sort of helping prisoners connect with their families, but also bringing their voices into the gallery. Yeah, we've got a huge amount of projects like that. You know, we've got a project with refugees as well at the moment, asylum seekers, where we sort of use our artworks in our building to help them feel less isolated, to connect to each other, to connect to people in the city. So I think it's those types of things that we do to sort of balance this quite big collection that we have, you know, that's very art historical and is increasingly, you know, diverse and very relevant to where we are today, but also holds those old masters that are difficult to interpret for people depending on their context. So a lot of things. You also asked about Elisa Nissenbaum. So Elisa Nissenbaum, we worked with over the past, I guess it's now 2.5 years. That's a project that we started before the pandemic. Elisa is a really incredible artist. You know, the way that she works with people, is incredibly open and collaborative. She's very much got a social praxis. And basically what she does is she paints people from a certain community. So in England, she did that with staff from the London Underground, where she painted people who worked on the Tube network, the Underground network. And the reason we invited her was that we felt it was a really good way to balance that idea of bringing in international artists, but very much connecting those international artists to our local communities. So the idea was that she was going to come to Liverpool for 4 months and she would be in residence with us. Very sadly, that didn't happen because of the pandemic. There was just no way to bring her over. So we started looking at ways that we could still work with her. And what we ended up doing was focusing her project on the National Health Service. So here in England, we've got free national health care for everyone. And obviously during the pandemic, that healthcare system was completely overwhelmed. And it had a huge impact on the professional lives, but also the personal lives of these people. And I think at the start of the pandemic, people were very aware of that. And, you know, we basically what we had is for 10 weeks, every Thursday evening, everyone would stand on their doorsteps and clap for the healthcare workers. But that very soon sort of left the media, you know, it wasn't really present anymore in the dialogue around the pandemic. So for us, it was a really incredible way to honor these people who are still working, you know, tirelessly for their own communities. And I mean, the response has been absolutely amazing, you know, to bring these people into the galleries, you know, their portraits, but also to bring them physically into the gallery and being able to see that and feel that they have a place within Tate has been really amazing. You're still muted.
No, you'd think after 2 years I would know better. Okay. You know, working with Elisa is powerful, and seeing yourself in the museum, I think we on this panel can all resoundingly say is critical to how we build collections and curate and form conversations. Has Tate Liverpool, it sounds like it was by design to work with the younger audiences, but has Tate Liverpool, has that been a challenge to say bring in an artist or work with community and navigate those kind of larger projects with maybe the larger oversight or bureaucracy, or even having community members understand the sometimes slower responses from an institution?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important to work quite closely with people to be able to have that understanding. Everything takes a hugely long time in a large institution like Tate. You know, nothing is instant. We can't just sort of instantly have a response or make a decision. But I think, you know, working with young people is something that we do across Tate. So there's certain things that are specific to Tate Liverpool, but we have our scheme for young people who can, across all sites, get discounts to come into the exhibitions. We have those types of projects working with young people to create events, which are incredibly collaborative. You know, it allows us to bring in a lot of different voices based on what those young people are interested in. You know, they will be the people to select their collaborators, to reach out to them. And obviously that support from Tate is there in the background, but it's very much a way of giving them their own agency. So yeah, that's definitely something that we do across the board.
I think that's a perfect moment to segue over to Maria Elena. And Maria, I have lived in Florida, but it was North Florida. That is not Miami.
No, that's not Miami, but it's the same state.
It is the same state. That is very true.
Yeah.
So I am so excited to talk to you about how your work has intersected across Miami, and really interested in hearing about not only the really complex and beautiful communities are the Caribbean and Latin communities that shape and form Miami, and Miami-Dade, let's be real, it's Miami-Dade and everything in between. But I'm also interested to hear about the CCI and your work in kind of creating this framework within the Perez. So I'm hoping you could share out what is the CCI and how has community shaped your curatorial practice in the region?
Definitely. And it's a pleasure to be here with, such esteemed colleagues. And, I'm just thankful. So I just want to say thank you for the invitation. So I would say this. Well, I would start saying that I definitely, like we all here agree in this panel, context is very important. And certainly the work that we've been doing at PAM responds to our context. And when working at PAM, we used to play a term called strategic regionalism, which was something that the previous chief, but it's this idea that we are consciously thinking about our neighbors, how to connect with them in a very, like equals, in terms like equals, to really cities and the differences of our experiences, right? So at PAM, we're very conscious about, we like to say that we're an international and contemporary art museum, but we're the best at showing artists from the African diaspora, African American, Latin American, Latinx, and also Caribbean art histories. So basically, we want to be in the national, international conversation, but also play, use our what I called our Miami lens or our specificity as a power source or something that we can really strive in. In terms of the CCI, the Carrion Cultural Institute is something that has a long history in the sense that unlike what Tamara was mentioning with Tate, that it has a really long collection. It started collecting or became a museum in the 90s. So it's one of the first work that came into the collection was actually a work by Lorna Simpson. So it's a very different kind of historical moment in which the museum is collected and is forming itself, which gives itself a lot of flexibility, of course, but also that sensibility of identity and so on have always been shaping exhibitions and collections. So in 2015, so I started collecting in the 90s, in 2013, it becomes the Paris Art Museum, which is actually the only museum in the nation that has a Latin last name as part of its name. And it's actually the name of Jorge Perez, which is a Cuban developer. So even, the person is actually coming from Cuba. And then in 2015, 2017, we had a strategic plan in which we were really looking at how we wanted to shape the next 5 years of the museum and what were going to be our core kind of programming and core curatorial themes that we wanted to tackle. And the Caribbean was one of those things. The museum always had Caribbean exhibitions, like from Cuban artists, which is actually the strength of our Caribbean collection, and Puerto Rican, and so on. But it recently, in 2013, that's when it started expanding into the other Caribbeans. I'm speaking about the English-speaking Caribbean, like Bahamas, Jamaica, the Dutch Caribbean, Aruba, the French Caribbean, Martinica, Guadeloupe, Haiti, So it was really an impetus to try to broaden our strategy about how to speak about Caribbean art histories and practice, but also cemented as a core aspect of the organization. So basically, this is a curatorial platform that right now supports some of our current exhibitions and some of our current programming, but also starts new initiatives. So one of the new things that we started doing was a fellowship program for researchers and for artists of Caribbean descent. And that's important because in a way we're directly supporting Caribbean art practice, but then also the researcher, we invite them to research our collection. And that's what's really important because, right now there's a strong interest in the Caribbean, but we're not gonna be there. I mean, I'm not gonna be there until eternity, right? So when we're gone, when this team is gone, at least there's gonna be research made with some of the works from our Caribbean holdings that don't often make it into exhibitions. And that often has to do with the fact that, we need more research on them, et cetera, et cetera. So way in which you can build on the institutional history and on the collection history of these artifacts, of these objects that we have in our exhibition. And it also prompts them to be exhibited more as well, because, you know, since the Caribbean becomes such an important theme for these researchers, then our exhibitions and our collection holdings also need to exemplify that. So, so those are ways in which we're trying to kind of build this more information and more content on a region that has been, you know, not as visible in our history. So that's a little bit of the CCI. And oh, go ahead.
No, please.
No, I wanted to say that in terms of the communities of Miami, you know, Miami is it's like, as we know, it's a majority city, which means that, you know, 60% are Latin, 20% is Black, and then the other 10 or 18 is white American. So I always like to say, you know, I'm Latin, I'm Black, that I'm part of the majority. And that's something really that we try to exemplify at the museum. And also, I have to say that in terms of context, even the way we speak about the experience of Blackness at PAM, it's unique to our context, because at PAM, you know, we have Bahamians, Puerto Ricans like myself, African Americans. We have all this diversity in terms of what the Black experience is, Haitians, that is very important for us to express that in our exhibitions. So for example, recently I curated this show called Ally with Power, which has, it's a selection from the recent acquisitions that Jorge Perez have been doing to our African and African diaspora artists. But the show includes African artists, like, you know, from Zimbabwe, South Africa, etc., along with Afro-Europeans, Afro-Latinos, Afro-Caribbeans, African Americans, all in this thing about Ally with Power, kind of thinking about how together, visibly, they hone into, you know, the power of their history. So it's not trying necessarily to kind of generalize, you know, all Black artists, but rather think about how these artists do share an experience of colonization and oppression that is significant, you know. And then you start thinking about, for example, you know, the fact that after slavery was over in the States, then apartheid, you know, emerged in South Africa, and you start seeing how the systems of, you know, white supremacy and racial oppression have been replicated in different parts of the world. And what does that mean? And how can we start thinking more collectively about those histories? So, and that's a way in which we take our, you know, I'm mentioning that exhibition because that's a way in which we take the specificity of our context in terms of, you know, the diversity of the Black experience to then speak about an international and national context.
You know, one of the things I'm struck by, and this, I'll open this up to everyone, but Maria Elena in particular here, is that we're talking about region, and I think it's safe to say that we work at regional museums, but yet there is this dialogue that goes both ways. It's fluid. There is a national and international, and then the regional. And so I am really interested to hear, what is that like to have those internal conversations about region and regionality when there is a real pressure to, at least in where I'm working, to speak to a national context, to speak to the global, whether it's like the global histories of our collection or the broader perspective, and bring that down to a really specific context for our audiences. Oftentimes, I know I am confronted either with donors who don't quite get it, or either administrators, or, you know, the gamut. And so I'm really interested to hear, how has that been just working? Has it been frustrating, easy, no problems?
Oh, it's been so easy. No problems. Everything has been smooth as a whiskey, right? No, I mean, I think when I started working at PAM, I have to say that people, like, the Caribbean was still something very kind of hard to grasp, even though we have a big Haitian population in Miami, which has its own cultural center, the Little Haiti Cultural Center. But that's why there were some strategies put in place, that I think that alleviate that. And what I mean by that is when we did the strategic plan, that type of process involves board members, involves community stakeholders. So that's a really good way that we were able to get more people kind of say, yeah, let's do this. So, you know, all kind of working together. Then when we, you know, I forgot to mention a very important detail that the CCI is facilitated by a $1 million grant from the Mellon Foundation. So to be able to have a prestigious foundation support this and give a lifeline to it, that's certainly the way that we can not only do what we do, but then also continue sharing and educating and, you know, kind of, you know, sharing more what we're doing to get more people interested in it. So it's a process. Like, I don't think, you know, like everything is a process that requires different strategies. But that's okay, because I think that, you know, the more you do it, I in my experience, the more that you see people interested. And sometimes it's like everything, like if right now, if you offer me something that I may not know about, I may be a little bit hesitant. But the more I get exposed to it, the more I understand. And that has been really great to see. It has been really great to see, you know, donors starting to buy work from artists that they wouldn't have bought works before, you know, and get excited. And also even, I remember being in an elevator and one of the donors say, oh, I saw an artist that I think you're gonna like. And just really who? And it was Ebony Patterson. I was like, oh, great. You know, like, you know, this is like, they're totally like, you know, learning with us. So in that sense, I think that, you know, it's a positive experience nonetheless.
I think the question about the I guess tension there around regionalism and serving international audiences, I think is informed by two conflicting forces, probably more, but generalize into two. One's about you know, the increasing prevalence of the internet, consolidation of media companies, and so thus people there being a uniformity to discussions that you know, less local media and more connection of people having dialogues with not constricted to the centers, but having being able to connect like this without me traveling to a major center outside of Regina, then that creates a little bit more mobility and people thinking about their relationship to international politics, to other larger forces, or maybe forces that dominate those news cycles, like United States discourse and dialogue. And then the inverse of that is the increased specificity that we're seeing, like Maria was mentioning about the bringing in that increased specificity around Black and Latinx perspectives and identities, which is something similar. I'm also co-chair of the Indigenous Curatorial Collective, and that's something very prominent in Indigenous artistic circles right now, is about that specificity that I'm a Chickasaw citizen living in Treaty 4 territory, growing up in a predominantly urban experience. And so about how that those experiences inform my perspective, that makes it very different, and still positions me as a guest within this territory, and how we navigate those that real specificity and identity, and in region where in the Lindsay, we speak about Turtle Island, North America. We speak about the Great Plains, which encompasses a large amount of the central United States, as well as the prairies here in Canada. But then a lot of our curators, folks who grew up in Saskatchewan, their families have been here as long as the land has existed, who still call themselves guests in this territory because they as their families are from a little north of here, up in Cumberland House, or and they're Swampy Cree, not Plains Cree. So there's this convergence of that specificity and also a generalization, and that's happening, that museums and galleries are both responding to and also be a part of and play a role in helping shape how those we define ourselves in relation to that.
And talking about region and talking about the communities in which we serve, I want to go back to something that Tamar pointed out, and that was the NEH is something very specific in the United States, but the National Health Services, and thinking about another way to define community, and that is through labor, and the labor within a specific region. I think that kind of unique reframing, especially when we think about the northern part of England and how complex that history is too, compared to maybe what us internationally might be more familiar with in terms of London. How has that really reframed your praxis, and is reshaping what community kind of means either through labor or other demographics come into play more and more frequently as we continue to move forward post-pandemic?
I mean, for us, absolutely. I think, sort of tying in with your last question, I think the main challenge for us for a long time has been, visitor numbers, the expectation of having these large blockbuster shows and having really well-performing, well-known artists, solo exhibitions, which obviously then takes away an opportunity to focus more on, what's relevant to the region itself. And I think definitely now that the tourism element has been taken away, that pressure isn't there as much. It was something for us that was already very much shifting. We're very lucky. Liverpool is a very proud city. People are very proud to be Liverpudlian, very proud to be from the north. There's a very strong sense of identity here. And I think because of that, we've got a very close-knit group of supporters around us. So that in itself has allowed us to focus more on what's important in Liverpool. So this goes back a bit to your last question, but just as an example, we were able to put out an open call for artists from the Northwest. And we should have already had a second one by now, but the first one has been delayed. But because of that, we're able to work very closely with a local artist, and through her also working very closely with local fabricators, local filmmakers. So it almost brings together a new community in terms of labor, because you create this new group around a show that wasn't connected before, but that hopefully is one that will stay to a certain extent. Because I think that's the other thing that's very important, is how can we create connections with local communities that last and that aren't just temporary. And I think by having that close involvement in exhibitions for us, that's a really good way of doing it.
I have a really simple question, but I know the answer will not be simple. What is an authentic relationship with a community?
I would say one that's collaborative, and that's not just an institution taking from a community what it needs without giving anything back, if that makes sense. I think that's why for us it has been so important to have those truly collaborative projects, and something like Tate Exchange, where we almost sort of hand over control to a certain group, rather than us just trying to dictate what the community does. And I think, having those lasting connections is something that we just have to continuously work on. I think that's the only way it can be an authentic relationship, is if it's not just, something connected to one moment in time.
I think that's a great bridge to a question. Oh, I'm sorry, Maria Elena, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to add something because I think that to what Tamara was saying, because I think that like at museums, we also work slow and fast at the same time. So often I believe that in order to have like in order to know a community, you need like at least a year. And sometimes we're not given a year with a project. So for me, something that has worked very well is transparency. Like if I am clear in terms of what are my intentions and what I'm trying to get to, and if the the counterpart is also clear, we get to a better place. So I think transparency is very, very important.
Yes, agreed with both points, Tamara and Maria Elena. So Cecilia asks, we see in all cases a context extremely complex, in particular, linked to history and politics. Could we say that their actions and selection of programming are rooted in an act of resistance or activism inside art institutions? What are the difficulties to make those actions inside larger arts institutions?
There may be a distinction between activism and artistic practice, which I think there's a real connection and relevance there. And I do believe in the museums are not neutral sentiment and movement, that to not address these complexities and these current dialogues, or to try to maintain a neutral stance, is in support of the status quo. So that is an active choice, and does support a specific worldview and dialogue. So we are doing that whether we want to or not. And it's about being intentional about what type of futures and culture you want to support and create, and being, and we try to situate that in being artist driven in that respect, and also in relation to our treaty responsibilities, which are emblazoned on our building, as you can see behind us. But for me, activism is really about pushing for a specific action or need or responsibility, or a specific change. And what happens within an art gallery is that maybe there's a little bit of direction or focus given to an issue, but more it's about giving space, context, material for contemplation, for imagination, for expanding understanding, that allows you to think larger than yourself and in relation to the artist, to these larger contexts. And it requires a little bit of it's not completed until the audience is there, being an active participant and coming to that understanding together with the artwork, or in relation to the performers, or however this is being realized. And so in that respect, I think it's maybe a little bit less directed than activism often, but then can be more, can create a different type of change, because it's driven by the individuals having that experience, that it's there, that you have to come to those conclusions on your own, and it's not necessarily just aligning yourself to someone else's determined belief.
So we have another question here. So how do museums, curators, how do we navigate sharing work by artists who are inspired by regions and cultures that are not their own? This seems to be a question around appropriation, appreciation, and the larger debate therein. There seems to be a fine line to tread between well-intentioned in terms of normalizing diversity in subject matter and appropriation. And I'll maybe start and say that depending I think it always starts with, at least from my experience, it starts with knowledge and knowing the communities that are being discussed and really asking why we're bringing in that work versus another work. It's a dialogue. And there are also in the United States strict laws, in particular around Indigenous works of art and what is considered Indigenous work, what is considered appropriation, etc. But the moderator will step back coyly.
I think that's a great question and a very complex one. Mainly because I'll say this, as a curator, when there's certain topics being talking about that I feel like pertain a lot to my own personal experience, of course I feel like I should be the one speaking. So there's that part, but then I've also seen artists of color using, tropes and motifs from other cultures, like, I don't know, like an African-American artist using Latino type of stuff, and or a Latino artist using indigenous motifs, which is very common in Latin American art practice. So I myself wrestle with that a little bit, and I do think that what I try to investigate or be aware of is that not everybody's at the same level of conversation. And what I mean by that is in the US, there's a very, for reasons that we know, there's a long history of these types of conversation, but that's not the same case in like Puerto Rico, where I'm from. In Puerto Rico, still people abide to this idea that, you're Puerto Rican if you're Black, Taino, or European Spanish. So you would come across people that would use certain tropes from Indigenous or Black or African motifs that are actually, what I think of like Puerto Rican, and they think that's okay because of the culture. So what I'm trying to say here is that, not everybody or not every nation or country is at the same plane with the conversation. And I think that we have to be mindful of that, because ultimately we want to have the conversation. So, I steer from being too confrontational, because I do think that the idea is for us to talk about it and talk about what it means, what cultural appropriation really means in our specific contexts and cultures. I hope that made some sense.
I think that was a great answer. For us, I think one of the things that we've been looking at is how that applies to our more historical collection. We've obviously got a lot of modernist artists in our collection who, if we look from today's perspective, very much appropriated techniques, symbols from other cultures. So we recently opened a display that actually very openly looks at that, and that sort of places works by Western, mainly white male modernists, alongside works from similar periods by artists from other parts of the world, and sort of looks at how, how there has, on the one hand, been an exchange of certain techniques, but how there's also been appropriation. So I think for us, that's a way of sort of opening up that dialogue, but also allowing visitors to see those connections for themselves.
I think I agree with both panelists, and it's really about power and platform, and about who's being given the platform to represent these artistic practices, and is it people who have a deep knowledge of them, or someone who has a surface knowledge that is just that sees something attractive that they want to replicate, and then that becomes the dominant understanding of this cultural practice. And I think that that's in those cases, you can talk about the artist's responsibility there, but it's also a curatorial failure in showing the not the best representation of these practices or movements. For Tamar's example there, I think a good one when there's, you're dealing with a collection or important historical work of just giving that full story and context there. We held an exhibition before I arrived at the Mackenzie, and I got to see it and work a little bit on the aftermath, but of Sorain Stump, who's an Italian who came to Canada and then took on various Indigenous identities, and then was the founder of an Indigenous, I think it was the Indian Cultural College art program. And so he taught many of the very prominent Indigenous artists who are like Edward Poitras, who the first Indigenous person to represent Canada at the Venice Biennial was one of his students, Gerald McMaster. And so he had this immense impact on what Indigenous art is today, but he's this Italian guy claiming these various identities and then eventually adopted into a Cree community. So that makes it more complex because he is now Cree through adoption. But by sharing that background and that story and not saying, well, because it's complex dealing with the estate and all of those factors, we are still going to stick by that. We have to just say that this is an Italian man who took on these forms and then had this far-reaching impact.
On that complex note, I am going to, excuse me, we're going to have to say goodbye and turn it back over to Monica and Judith. So thank you both. And thank you, Tamar, John, and Maria and Elena for sharing your insights. This is a conversation that can and probably should go on beyond today. So thank you all, and thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you. Yeah, okay.
I'm Monica Valenzuela, Program Manager for AAMC and AAMC Foundation. Thank you for joining our program today, and a special thanks to our speakers for sharing their experience and expertise with us. A recording will be available on our website, artcurators.org, and our YouTube channel shortly. Please help support our capacity to continue programs such as today's event by making a donation today. A gift of any amount will have a direct impact on our work. Thank you, stay well, and join us again soon.